Hello, this is my story. This is the story of Free Frank McWorter in New Philadelphia, by myself, Nathaniel Roman. So what we'll discuss. So I begin by I'll talk about his early life, and his personal life, and that kind of goes into then like his business ventures and how he made his money to then establish the town of New Philadelphia, which becomes the first uh one of the first integrated towns in America. And then in the conclusion, I'll go over the implications of his life and his career, and of course, the town of New Philadelphia. So first, Free Frank was born in 1777, in South Carolina. His mother was Judah, who was an African slave, taken directly from Africa. And his father is believed to be their enslaver. It's not like officially confirmed, but judging based off the time, this was likely the case. Um, and his name was George McWorter. So of course, Frank took his last name. Um, and around in the late 1790s, mid 1790s, um, Frank and George end up moving to Kentucky and leave Judah behind. And she gets kind of lost in the records, but George McWhorter goes there to establish his business and expand his land holdings. So, what was life in Kentucky like? So, George had his business, and basically, what his business, he had a farm, and he took up like developing land. So, he would usually would steal land from Native Americans or buy land, I guess, that was stolen, clear the forest or the plain or whatever it was, and get it ready to be sold. Usually would till the land or something like that, and get it ready maybe for farmland. And he did this because this was at the time, this was like basically the new frontier. So he was part of that, the move westward. And additionally, what he would do, what George would do is he had four slaves, and because Pulaski County, where they moved to, was had a very low slave owning population, a very low slave population. What George found very profitable was to rent out Frank's labor and the labor of his other slaves, to people doing the same thing, developing land, or who had farmland of their own. And that became a very profitable side of his business. Um, Eventually, George leaves and tries to basically have the same business model. He moves to Tennessee, and because of this, he allows Frank to hire his own time because he obviously he's not there to manage it, and he leaves Frank his land to manage. An event, yeah, right. He lets Frank hire his own time, and Frank eventually establishes his own businesses. But in 1815, when George dies in Tennessee, uh, Frank is supposed to be manumitted. However, the executors of George's will, um, say that Frank now has to pay a $500 sum for his freedom. And he doesn't do it immediately, although he eventually does. So Frank, in growing his wealth, he first he hired his time, and he used the money he got from hiring his time to buy the tools to have a saltpeter manufacturer, to be a saltpeter manufacturer. And basically, what that was saltpeter was mined, and then he put it through a chemical process that made it a component that was used in gunpowder. And so obviously this business took off in 1812 because of the War of 1812, and the demand for gunpowder. But even afterwards, as people are getting more and more armed and America's developing, um, there's a continual need for gunpowder, and yeah, it's a profitable business for him. He eventually takes the money that he gained from the saltpeter manufacturing and uses it to purchase and develop land similar to what um, similar to what George was doing. Um, and he frees his wife Lucy in 1817, and she makes money selling crafts, and doing laundry and things like that, sort of more household services, that she would, they made a profit from. So what was Frank's family life like? So he married Lucy, who was a slave of the Denham family, which was a neighbor and in-law of George McWorter. They get married in 1999, and I do the air quotes because I'm sorry, not 1899, 1799. Um, because at this time, marriage between slaves was not legal necessarily. So it wasn't officially recognized. But the the Denham family saw this as very lucrative for them because any children that came as a result of this couple, of this relationship, would belong to the Denhams. So they have their first daughter, Judah, and he names his daughter after his mother, in 1800. And they end up having four between 1800 and 1817. They have four of 13 children that survive till adulthood. And later on in the 1820s, I believe it's his first son, young Frank, was able to escape to Canada. Um, he escaped slavery, and eventually Frank frees all of his children. So, what was that journey to freedom like for Frank and his family? Um, so he buys Lucy's freedom in 1817, um, because he wants his next children to be born free. So that's the economical decision instead of freeing himself. And then eventually in 1819, so 4 years after he was supposed to be manumitted, upon George's death, he buys his own freedom. And in 1820, you can see at the bottom, he changes his name to Free Frank. And he does this sort of in order to uh, try to eliminate the plausible deniability of putting him back into slavery. If a slave catcher were to catch him, it'd be harder for them to say, "Oh, I didn't know he was free." Um, and then right in 1829 is when he trades his saltpeter mine, his saltpeter manufacturing business for his son's freedom, the one that escaped to Canada. And he sells it to, uh, I believe he sells it to the Denham family who owns his son. And then past this, he continues to free his family, um, past his death, even past his death, he dies in 1853. And it costs in 1850s money $14,000. Um, he eventually decides to move to Illinois because he wants a safer life for his children. He does this around in the 1830s and late 1820s, 1830s. He does this because he wants a safer life for his free children, and he bought a lot of cheap land and developed it. And he was accepted by this community that he comes into. Of course, it's very rural, very separated, but he builds roads that connect the town to rivers and to main streets, and he eventually, builds up this community. And that is the community, the town, that he eventually establishes of New Philadelphia. And basically, he bought an 80-acre plot for $100, and he cleared it, and he built roads, and he established the town. Um, so this consisted of his family, other families, other black families, and other white families, and it was a nearly entirely integrated town. And this is a photo here of the school, of New Philadelphia, and you can see that it is a mix of black and white children. And this town survives from the 1830s all the way until almost to the turn of the century, but it dies out shortly before. But it reached its peak just after the Civil War, um, because it had a lot of promise. But unfortunately, in the 1870s, 1880s, it starts to die out because it's missed by the railroad, and and the railroad was previously giving it a lot of its, foot traffic, a lot of its business was coming from the railroad. And the town eventually dies out. Today, it is a site, an archaeological site, to gain a better understanding of what New Philadelphia looked like. Um, and so the McWorters in Philadelphia, so they officially got married in 1839. Lucy and Frank did, and so they're officially married. Like I said, Frank and his children continue to emancipate themselves. Um, he emancipates his oldest daughter, Judah, finally at age 50. And although Frank dies in 1853, he continues to his family, his relatives continue to free each other. And the 14,000 that I said before, and today's money would be about $500,000, which is the money that he used to free his family. So what are the implications of Free Frank and sort of what is his legacy? So it's evidence, obviously, that Black people were a part of westward expansion and manifest destiny, and all of these things that we ideals that we associate with the antebellum period. So yeah, and it's an example of a successfully integrated town, even back in the mid 1800s. It shows sort of the determination and ability of Free Frank, and that can be generalized a little bit to other slaves who were able to achieve similar things to Free Frank, that it wasn't just like a sort of a luck kind of thing, but they were actually very intentional. And of course, it was a luck, like they had a lot of beneficial circumstances that allowed them to do so, but it wasn't like they just happened on it. It was very intentional the way they built up their success. Um, and yeah, he was able to make enough money to set up his family well, and sort of, continue to have this to set up New Philadelphia, which is a very important town for understanding that era. These are my citations. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation.